Hey friends, Sunwarper here. Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I want to talk about Dawless setups. So over the last year on my YouTube channel, I've been making weekly videos using a Dawless setup, either with the SP404, the circuit tracks, or even the P033 of late, and even sometimes Koala Sampler on iOS. I've had a lot of fun doing it, and most of my musical output in the last year, even on Spotify and things like that, has been with a Dawless setup. But today I want to talk about the lessons I've learned working with the Dawless setup over the last year, and mainly whether I think Dawless is even worth it. And I also want to share some things I've learned along the way so that if you're looking to get started with the Dawless setup, you don't have to make the same mistakes I've made. Before we talk about anything, I think it's important that we define what Dawless is. Dawless music is making music without the aid of a computer. So instead of working with a computer and a DAW or a digital audio workstation, you're working with Grooveboxes, sequencers, and samplers to create music. I think the biggest part of it is just being away from the computer and having smaller pieces of gear that do everything. You might be asking, why would you use a Dawless setup when a computer can do so much more better and cheaper? And I think that's a really interesting question, because going Dawless doesn't have to be an either or. If it is only Dawless or only DAW usually wins out. But there is something to be said about the tactile nature of using a Dawless setup where everything is right in front of you and what you see is what you get. So if you're feeling stuck or that everything's starting to sound very samey in a DAW, I would recommend checking out some Dawless setup. But that brings up a good question. In a sea of hardware, what's the best place to start? So this is a pretty open-ended question, and it can vary depending on your sound preferences, genre of music, or just needs in general. With that being said, a great starting point is typically some sort of groove box like a Circuit Tracks, an Octatrack, or something like the Roland MC707. From there, you'll be able to sequence gear, typically if it has MIDI outs, which is very important. If you want to send something in with MIDI to control it, you could do that, or connected to a computer, you could have a MIDI in to control your groove box. And typically with groove boxes, or the whole point of a groove box, is to have basically a one and done machine where you could do whole song creation. There are a lot of limitations. Take, for example, the Circuit Tracks, where you have 4 tracks of samples or drums, 2 tracks of built-in synths, and 2 tracks of MIDI if you wanted to connect synths and things like that. So that's a total of, let's say, 4 drum sounds if you're using all drums on those 4 sample sounds, 2 synths, and 2 MIDI. It's very limiting, but that's kind of the fun of a Dawless setup. With that being said, you can then start expanding with additional synths, which are connecting via MIDI, or checking out samplers like the SP404 or the 1010 Black Box, anything like that. There's tons. I went for the SP404 because there's a long playback time, which is very important for me. So I think that's a good place to start talking about my journey through Dawless and where I started with it and where I ended. So my journey started with the Circuit Tracks. I really loved the machine. It got me out of a creative rut, and it's a lot of fun to use. It doesn't have a screen, but it is very intuitive, but there's a lot you can do with it. One of the most fun things I've done with it is creating a whole generative type sound where I use randomization and probability per step in the step sequencer to create generative sound. As I mentioned in the previous segment, you get 2 MIDI outs, so you can control 2 pieces of gear from it. So it's a really good brain or hub to a MIDI setup. But from the circuit, I wanted to expand, so I started creating a Dawless desk, for lack of a better word, and I put a few synths on it. I used the Dreadbox Erebus, the Korg Minilogue, and the Behringer MS-1. 2 of those are behind me. And once I added those, I was able to really fatten up the sound and change that very cold sound that the Circuit's Nova engine synths have. But adding those other synths really started changing how I viewed sound design in a Dawless setup. The only thing that it was lacking then was larger amounts of tracks. As I mentioned, you only get the 4 drum or sample tracks, 2 MIDIs, and 2 internal synths. I needed more, especially trying to emulate songs that I made in a DAW. So that's when I added a sampler. With the SP and the Circuit and some synths, that was where things started to really come together, and I could see releasing full-on music with a Dawless setup. My first setup was the Circuit as the brain, sending MIDI to 2 synths, and then I had the SP which all the audio from the circuit was being routed into. I could do effects and I could trigger additional samples live. My only issue with this, especially for live performance, was the large amount of real estate it took. So synths can take up a lot of space, and then you have the circuit and the SP. So in my quest for a very portable setup, I took it all back and pared it down to just the SP and the circuit. So the circuit could work for drums and some live performance and some MIDI with the internal synths, and then the SP would be used for additional samples or stem playback. And I really like this setup. I've just started growing a little bit away from my circuit, and so the setup I've been doing more recently is an iOS device like my iPad, playing either Koala or an iPad app or iOS app, running into the SP, and then the SP would be the sequencing and the stem and sample playback. And this has been a really fun way of doing it, and it's such a smaller setup. Like, I could throw that in a backpack even easier than the circuit with all those knobs. You could even connect it with USB-C to C or something like that and control MIDI both ways. There's some really cool ways you can sequence a phone with a SP. And that's something I'm going to explore more. As of now, I've just done audio sent out from the phone, usually from Koala, into the SP for treatment or effects treatment, and additional samples and sequencing on the SP. So if you want to see more with this setup and pairing it via MIDI, hit that subscribe button. So that was my journey of a year of Dawless music making. But now it's time to talk about lessons I've learned during this year, and I feel like I've learned a lot. And while Dawless setups definitely have their drawbacks, they are very rewarding and intuitive, and I think that's the strongest feature, is that you can create it however you want, and whatever format works for you the best, you can make that. And then you have the much more tactile nature of, if you move something, something changes. You also have sequencers. Being away from the computer and just having several pieces of hardware that do dedicated functions each, there's just something special about it and inspiring, especially if you like working in that way. And if you don't and you'd rather have all the options of a computer, that's okay. And like I said, you can have both with a hybrid setup, and that's kind of where I'm moving now. That's kind of my poor way of explaining the lessons I've learned, but I want to break it down a little bit better. One of the biggest things to consider when you're looking into a Dawless setup or getting into Dawless is price. It can add up very quickly, and that's a good thing to keep in mind depending on your budget, to figure out what you need to make what you want to make and go from there. For me personally, I started with the circuit tracks. I think it's $400. It's worth the money in my opinion, despite what I've mentioned about its drawbacks, especially if you're looking to sequence external gear. It's a very good price for what it can do and what it offers. There is some sampling functionality by connecting it to a computer and using the components program. I really think one of the best ways to start is a Groovebox and a sampler, or something that can kind of do both. Being able to send MIDI out to devices and having sample playback, where you could have full stems you've made in a DAW, create stems, resample things, put it in. The SP404 is very high in my book, but I'm biased because I own it. I don't own many other samplers besides the P033, and this is not a very good brain. It's a very awesome sampler, but it's kind of a very one-trick pony. The SP can do a lot more, and something like the MPC seems like it can do even more. Perhaps, I don't have one. If you have an MPC, let us know your setup if you use one. And yeah, that's probably its biggest drawback, especially when you consider something like Logic is only a couple $100 and can do all that and then some. But for me, there's the fun factor and the inspiration that a Dawless setup can bring that does personally make it worth it, and maybe it will for you as well. Especially if you find you get tired of either staring at a screen or just doing the same things in a DAW, you may want to just check out a Dawless setup, or even use Koala Sampler or something like that on your phone, just to see how you get on with a different workflow. So after a year of making music this way, would I do it again? Yeah, I think so, but I think there's a caveat. Dawless music making is very fun, it's very inspiring, and I find my workflow is much faster. I don't second guess myself as often. I'm not endlessly tweaking things in the mix like I do with the DAW, because in a DAW I feel like I get option paralysis. Like, there's just so many choices. I never want to finish and just like make a choice. So with the Dawless setup, it's made for you pretty much. That's all you got. So in that respect, I do like it. But sometimes you really do want to get into a kick and make some more subtle changes to it. And there are ways with the setup I currently have to do that, and with different setups, there's better ways to do it or easier ways to do it, but it's just nice to be able to go in the DAW, change the sound around, and put it back. And so for me, I think it was worth it. I'll keep doing it, but I want to be able to also have that DAW functionality and power behind it. So a hybrid setup is now how I'm looking at it. And it also depends on the style you're working with at the time. And it's all subjective. Like music itself, it's very subjective. So if it's something that intrigues you, I hope some of the tips and lessons I learned will help if you're getting into DAWless setups. And if you have been using a DAWless setup and you either still keep using it or have switched back to a DAW or to a DAW, let us know in the comments why not, what your own personal journey has been. I'd love to hear about what you found useful or not useful in this type of setup. So yeah, thanks for joining me on this retrospective. It's been fun to look back at my last year in music making and see what worked, what didn't work, how I want to change things, whether I think it was worth it in the long run. I hope you take something away from it, and if you're looking to get into a DAWless setup, give it a shot. It's a ton of fun. I can't recommend it enough. I know I've said some pros, some cons, and I don't want to dissuade anyone from doing it because I really do think it is worth it. I just think it's good to know what you're getting into. So yeah, that's all I've got for today. If you want more production tips or to check out my music and merch, head to my website, sunwarper.com. I've also got a new year-long music project that I would love for you to join me on. It's called Music for Imagined Landscapes, and it's a combination of audio and visuals, with the music that I make every month having a visual component by giving a prompt to an AI about the track. So what I was imagining when I wrote the track, all that kind of stuff. And from there, the AI creates an image that is based on the track. It's over on my Bandcamp, but the singles will also be released every month on Spotify. So you can check all of it out at the link in the description. Until next time, thanks for watching.